I met Marcus at a homeless shelter volunteer event that his friend Jake had dragged me to. I wasn't really the volunteering type, but I figured it might look good on my resume, and maybe I'd meet some decent people for once. Marcus was ladling soup with this genuine smile, actually listening to the homeless guy's stories, instead of just going through the motions like everyone else. He had this quiet confidence about him. Nothing flashy, but you could tell he was the kind of man who had his shit together. When he asked me out for coffee the following weekend, I actually felt excited about a date for the first time in months. Those first 2 years were honestly pretty great. Marcus worked in accounting at some mid-level firm. Nothing glamorous but steady, and he treated me like I was something special. He'd plan these thoughtful little dates, remember things I mentioned in passing, and he had this way of making me feel secure and cared for. I genuinely loved how reliable he was. How he'd text me good morning every day, and never made me wonder where I stood with him. He wasn't the most exciting guy I'd ever dated, but there was something refreshing about being with someone who actually had his life together instead of the usual losers I seemed to attract. When he proposed after we'd been serious for about 2 years, I said yes without hesitation. The engagement lasted about a year, and I threw myself into planning our wedding. We had this beautiful outdoor ceremony, nothing too expensive but elegant. And I remember feeling genuinely happy walking down that aisle. Marcus looked at me like I was the most important person in his world. And for those first couple years of marriage, I felt like we had something real. But somewhere around year 3, I started noticing things. We'd go to dinner with other couples, and I'd hear about their trips to Europe, their weekend getaways to wine country, their spontaneous adventures. Meanwhile, Marcus and I were having date nights at chain restaurants and taking our annual vacation to his parents' lake house. Don't get me wrong, I appreciated that he was financially responsible, but I started feeling like we were living this small, predictable life while everyone else was actually experiencing things. I'd scroll through social media and see Jessica posting photos from her 3rd international trip that year, or Amanda showing off the designer bag her husband surprised her with. And I'd look around our modest little house with its budget furniture and feel this growing sense that I was settling for less than I deserved. When I'd bring up the idea of maybe splurging on a real vacation, somewhere exotic, Marcus would pull out his spreadsheets and explain why it wasn't practical right now, how we needed to focus on building our emergency fund or contributing to retirement. Responsible? Yes. But God, it was boring. I started feeling like Marcus saw me as this accessory to his careful, planned-out life rather than a partner whose dreams mattered. He'd get this pleased little expression when he'd show me how much money he'd saved us by booking some cabin 2 hours away, instead of the Greek islands I'd been hinting about for months. He'd talk about our future like it was all mapped out. The same house, the same routines, the same modest vacations until we were old and gray. Where was the passion? Where was the ambition to actually live instead of just existing? I tried to talk to him about it, but Marcus had this way of listening that felt more like he was waiting for me to finish talking so he could explain why I was being unrealistic. He'd nod and make understanding sounds, but then launch into some speech about being grateful for what we had and how stability was more important than excitement. It was like being married to a financial advisor instead of a husband who wanted to explore the world with me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Marcus was fundamentally limited in ways that were only going to get worse with time. He was content with mediocrity, happy to live this small life. And he expected me to be satisfied with that too. But I wasn't built for that kind of existence. I had dreams, ambitions, desires that went beyond his careful little comfort zone. And I was starting to feel suffocated by his lack of vision. I became distant. I'll admit that. It was hard to feel close to someone who seemed so determined to keep us trapped in this bubble of boring responsibility. When he'd try to plan our budget date nights or show me his latest savings goal, I'd just nod and go through the motions, but inside I was screaming with frustration. This wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, and I was tired of pretending to be grateful for scraps when I deserved so much more. That's when I started thinking about other options. I wasn't talking about cheating or anything sordid like that. I was thinking about opening up our marriage in a mature, adult way that would allow both of us to explore connections with people who might better understand our individual needs. I knew Marcus would probably be shocked at first, but honestly, it seemed like the most fair solution. I could find someone who shared my appetite for adventure and excitement, and he could probably find some other boring person who got excited about retirement planning and coupon clipping. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. We could maintain our partnership, our shared life, but also have the freedom to connect with people who actually complemented our personalities. I mean, I was being incredibly generous by even suggesting it, instead of just asking for a divorce outright. Most women in my situation would have just left, but I was trying to find a way to make things work for both of us. So on a Saturday morning, while Marcus was reading the paper and drinking his coffee in that predictable way he did every weekend, I decided it was time to have an adult conversation about our future. I sat down across from him and said, "Marcus, I want an open marriage." He looked up from his paper with this blank expression, like he didn't understand what I'd said. So I explained it to him calmly and rationally. I told him that I felt like we'd grown in different directions, that I needed experiences and connections that he wasn't able to provide, and that I thought opening up our marriage would allow both of us to be happier and more fulfilled. Marcus just stared at me for a long moment, not saying anything. I could see him processing it, probably trying to figure out some way to talk me out of it or negotiate some compromise that would keep us trapped in the same boring pattern. So I made it clear that this wasn't really a discussion. It was me telling him how things were going to be. This is how it's going to be. Marcus, either you accept it or you're holding me back. I expected him to argue, to get upset, maybe even to fight for us the way men do in movies. Instead, he just folded his paper, stood up, and said he was going for a drive. He didn't raise his voice, didn't beg me to reconsider, didn't even ask questions about what this would look like practically. He just left, and honestly, his lack of reaction was almost insulting. Here I was, trying to save our marriage in the most mature way possible, and he couldn't even be bothered to engage with the conversation. I figured he needed time to process it, which was fine. Change is hard for people like Marcus, and I knew he'd probably need a few days to wrap his head around the idea before we could have a real discussion about boundaries and logistics. I actually felt relieved that I'd finally been honest about what I needed, instead of continuing to pretend I was satisfied with his limited vision for our life. But Marcus didn't come back that day wanting to talk. He didn't come back wanting to work things out or negotiate terms. Instead, about 2 weeks later, I got served with divorce papers at our front door. I honestly couldn't believe it. This was his response to me trying to save our marriage. Divorce papers. I stood there staring at the legal documents, feeling like I was in some kind of alternate reality where the man I'd been married to for years had been replaced by a stranger. The Marcus I knew was conflict avoidant and accommodating, always trying to make me happy even when it was inconvenient for him. This dramatic, nuclear response was so unlike him that I almost wondered if someone else had put the idea in his head. When he came home that evening, I confronted him with the papers. I demanded to know if this was really how he wanted to handle things. If he was seriously going to throw away our entire marriage instead of having an adult conversation about what I needed. And that's when he dropped the real bombshell. Yes, I have a girlfriend. A girlfriend? Marcus, who apologized to waiters when they messed up his order, who needed me to pick out his clothes for work events, who had never shown any indication that he had the confidence or the game to actually attract another woman. He had a girlfriend. I was so shocked I could barely process it. I asked him when this had happened, how long it had been going on, and he told me he'd met her during the divorce process through mutual friends. Rachel, apparently some basic-looking girl who probably fell for his whole nice guy routine without seeing how boring and limited he really was underneath. The worst part was how calm he was about the whole thing. No guilt. No apology. No acknowledgement that he'd completely blindsided me. He just stood there like this was all perfectly reasonable. Like I was the one being dramatic for being upset that my husband had moved on before we'd even finished discussing the terms of opening our marriage. I tried to reason with him. I told him I still loved him. That I didn't actually want the open marriage anymore if it was going to cause this much drama, that I wanted us to go back to the way things used to be. I explained that I'd just been feeling restless and unfulfilled, but that we could work through it together if he'd just give us a chance. But Marcus had already made up his mind. He said he was happy with Rachel, that he was moving forward with the divorce, and that he thought it was better for both of us. Better for both of us. I was offering to forget the whole open marriage thing and go back to our normal life. And he was choosing some random girl he'd known for a few weeks over the woman he'd married and promised to love forever. When we signed the divorce papers, I felt like I was watching my entire life collapse. 5 years of marriage, gone, because Marcus couldn't handle one difficult conversation like an adult. But I wasn't going to just disappear quietly and let him rewrite history like I was the villain in this story. I reached out to Rachel on Facebook because I felt like she deserved to know the truth about who she was dating. I wasn't being malicious. I was trying to save her from wasting years of her life with someone who had serious commitment issues and a tendency to just shut down and run away the moment things got challenging. I explained that Marcus had a pattern of avoiding difficult conversations, that he'd abandoned our marriage instead of working through problems, and that she should be prepared for him to do the same thing to her eventually. Instead of thanking me for the warning, Rachel blocked me. Apparently, she'd rather live in ignorance than face the reality of Marcus's character flaws. Fine, but I wasn't going to be silenced just because she couldn't handle the truth. I tried calling Marcus to explain my side of things, to help him understand why his behavior was so hurtful and destructive. I sent emails trying to get him to see that throwing away our marriage over one disagreement was insane, that we could work through this if he'd just stop being so stubborn and dramatic. When he wouldn't respond to my calls or emails, I went by his office to try to have a face-to-face conversation like adults. But Marcus had apparently poisoned everyone against me, because his coworkers looked at me like I was some kind of crazy person instead of a woman who just wanted to talk to her ex-husband. He wouldn't even come out to see me, and security actually asked me to leave. It was humiliating and completely unnecessary. I also reached out to our mutual friends to explain what had really happened, because I knew Marcus was probably spreading his version of events and making me look like the bad guy. I told them the truth, that I'd tried to save our marriage by suggesting we open it up, and Marcus had responded by cheating on me and filing for divorce. Some of them seemed to believe his story over mine, which was incredibly disappointing but not entirely surprising. Marcus always was good at playing the victim when it suited him. The whole situation reached a breaking point when I went to his house one evening to try one more time to make him understand what he was throwing away. He was having dinner with Rachel, and I thought maybe if I could talk to both of them together, I could make them see how destructive this whole situation was for everyone involved. I wasn't trying to cause drama, I just wanted to remind Marcus of what we'd had together, to help him remember that 5 years of marriage meant something and couldn't just be erased because he was infatuated with some new person. But the moment I walked in, Rachel started acting like I was some kind of threat, and Marcus immediately went into defensive mode instead of being willing to have a rational conversation. I tried to explain to Rachel that she was being used as a rebound, that she was helping Marcus avoid dealing with the real issues in his life. But she just sat there looking at me like I was speaking a foreign language, and Marcus had the nerve to tell me I was trespassing and needed to leave immediately, like I was some stranger instead of the woman who'd shared a life with him for years. That's when I realized that Marcus had completely rewritten our history in his mind to make himself feel better about his choices. He'd convinced himself and everyone else that I was the problem. That I was some kind of unstable person who couldn't accept that the marriage was over, but the truth was, he was a coward who couldn't handle one difficult conversation. And rather than work through our problems like adults, he'd chosen to blow up our entire life and play house with the first woman who made him feel like a hero. After that confrontation, Marcus blocked me on everything. Phone, email, social media, the works. He even told our mutual friends to stop updating him about anything involving me, like I was some kind of dangerous person, instead of his ex-wife who just wanted closure and understanding. The whole thing was so typical of Marcus, running away from conflict instead of facing it head-on. He'd always been conflict avoidant, but I never thought he'd take it to such an extreme. A restraining order threat, for trying to have adult conversations, for wanting to understand why my marriage had ended. It was absolutely insane. Now here I am, months later, and Marcus is apparently living his happy little life with Rachel while I'm supposed to just pretend like none of it ever happened. Our mutual friends have mostly chosen sides, and unfortunately, most of them bought into his narrative about me being the unstable ex-wife who couldn't let go. Instead of seeing me as a woman who got abandoned by her husband for trying to save their marriage, the most frustrating part is that Marcus gets to be the victim in this story. He gets to tell people that his crazy ex-wife demanded an open marriage and then stalked him when he left her, completely leaving out the part where he was already emotionally checked out of our marriage and refused to even try to work through our problems. He gets to play the role of the long-suffering husband who finally found happiness with a woman who appreciates him, while I'm painted as the villain who couldn't accept that it was over. But I know the truth. I know that Marcus was fundamentally limited as a partner, that he was never going to be able to give me the kind of life I deserved, and that his inability to handle difficult conversations doomed our marriage from the start. I know that Rachel is settling for someone who will probably do the same thing to her eventually. And I know that I was actually trying to find a mature solution to our problems instead of just giving up like he did. The fact that I'm still single while Marcus has moved on doesn't mean I was wrong. It means I have higher standards than settling for the first person who comes along. It means I'm not willing to compromise my values and my needs just to avoid being alone. And honestly, being alone is better than being trapped in a marriage with someone who sees your dreams and ambitions as inconveniences to be managed rather than goals to be supported. I still think about what might have happened if Marcus had been willing to actually discuss the open marriage idea instead of just running away. We could have set boundaries, established rules, found a way to make it work for both of us. Instead, he chose the nuclear option and destroyed everything we'd built together because he couldn't handle the idea that I might need something more than his boring, limited vision for our life. Sometimes I wonder if Rachel knows what she's really gotten herself into. Does she know that Marcus will never be the kind of man who takes spontaneous trips or surprises her with grand romantic gestures? Does she realize that she's signed up for a lifetime of budget spreadsheets and modest vacations and careful, practical decisions that prioritize security over adventure? Maybe she's the type of person who's satisfied with that kind of existence. But I wasn't, and I don't think that makes me the villain in this story. I tried to save my marriage. I tried to find a solution that would work for both of us. And when that didn't work, I tried to help Marcus understand what he was throwing away and help Rachel understand what she was getting into. None of that makes me crazy or unstable. It makes me someone who was willing to fight for what mattered to me instead of just walking away the moment things got complicated. But Marcus will never see it that way. And apparently neither will anyone else. I'm the crazy ex-wife who couldn't let go. And he's the poor victim who finally found happiness after escaping his toxic marriage. That's the story everyone wants to believe. So that's the story that stuck. The truth is messier and more complicated. But nobody wants to hear about how Marcus was emotionally unavailable long before I suggested opening our marriage, or how his refusal to even discuss my needs contributed to the breakdown of our relationship. Nobody wants to acknowledge that I was actually trying to save us, or that his decision to immediately run to another woman instead of working on our problems says more about his character than mine. So here I am, supposedly bitter and alone according to everyone who's chosen to believe Marcus's version of events. And maybe I am bitter that I wasted 5 years of my life with someone who was never going to be capable of the kind of partnership I needed. Bitter that he gets to be the hero in this story while I'm the villain. Bitter that I'm starting over while he's playing house with someone who's probably going to realize what I realized eventually. But I'm not wrong about what I needed. And I'm not wrong about what Marcus was incapable of providing. The fact that our marriage ended badly doesn't change the fact that we were fundamentally incompatible, or that I deserved better than spending my life pretending to be satisfied with mediocrity. Maybe someday Marcus and Rachel will hit the same wall that we did. Maybe she'll start wanting more than his careful, practical approach to life can provide, and maybe then he'll understand what I was trying to tell him. Or maybe she really is satisfied with that kind of existence, in which case they're probably perfect for each other and I dodged a bullet. Either way, I know I was right to ask for what I needed, even if I was wrong about how to get it. And I know that Marcus's inability to handle difficult conversations and his tendency to run away from problems instead of working through them would have destroyed our marriage eventually, with or without my suggestion about opening it up. That's what I tell myself when I'm alone in my apartment, scrolling through social media and seeing their happy photos together. I tell myself that I was brave enough to ask for what I needed, even when it was uncomfortable, and that his response proved that he was never the right partner for me anyway. I tell myself that being alone and honest about what I want is better than being in a relationship where I have to pretend to be satisfied with less than I deserve. Sometimes I even believe it,